It's time for the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is the voice of the working class, Rick Smith.
So I got to tell you, like we said, hopeful something gets done. I would have liked to have seen the $6 trillion Build Back Better plan actually do some things that will help us build back better. That's kind of the thought. But it got watered down to 3.5, and now we're at 1.75. And I don't even know that is going to happen. I'm still on the not sure yet, but here to share some thoughts on. Well, is this good? Is this going to help us? Is it something that we should be excited about? Because we're seeing a bunch of posturing at this moment. And also, does that deadline at the end of this month happen? I'm not quite so sure. That's why we've asked Bill Scheer to come talk with us. Bill is a contributing editor over at Politico magazine. Bill, thanks for taking time for us.
Always a pleasure.
So let's start there. I understand. Have the Democrats moved the deadline for the end of this month? I thought I saw that they were moving it to December. Is that accurate?
That's my understanding, that they flinched from holding a vote on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. They instead passed an extension of the Highway Trust Fund through December 3rd. And that's what happened last month. The Highway Trust Fund generally gets extended for 5-year periods. There's a 5-year extension in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And if that did lapse, then financing for state and local transit and road projects would be dicey. I mean, projects wouldn't cease altogether right away, but money that would be coming in otherwise the states couldn't count on it. So that was supposed to be a pressure point to get the bigger bill done, but they keep flinching on it because progressives in the House have said we're not going to do this unless this is done in tandem with the broader Build Back Better bill. And even though there's a framework that was released by the White House today, it was not a full-blown legislation. It didn't have every T crossed. It didn't have explicit support for Manchin and Sinema. And so we're basically where we were 1 month ago.
Yeah, and this has been my fear all along, that we keep pushing it back, and we get the strategic pause that Joe Manchin wanted until we get to the point to where nothing gets done, and politically you take a bloodbath, and still we're another years behind actually getting our infrastructure fixed and doing the things that we need to get done.
I mean, what I find bizarre about this is the delay is in many respects what Manchin wants. Manchin wanted a pause. He's getting it. He even said at one point that we should let the pandemic relief process play out longer, see how inflation goes, before deciding whether to do Build Back Better at all. Now he was apparently willing to still do this in a more limited form, but waiting doesn't seem to make Manchin sad. And the logic behind the progressives' logic behind holding the bipartisan infrastructure bill hostage was that it was going to entice Manchin and Sinema to get this done. And I just don't see that happening. I understand the logic going into it, but it's been a month, and all we've seen is Build Back Better get smaller, and we don't see Manchin and Sinema get antsy about finalizing that deal. So I just feel at this point, get some points on the board. Get something done now. Biden's had weeks and weeks of no good headlines.
Right.
Let's get a good headline day and get some momentum going again, but that's not the path that they're on right now.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, and you're saying pass the bipartisan bill, take that as a win, and forget about the other one because it's never going to pass. Is that what I'm hearing?
No. I'm not saying that. I think the notion that Manchin and Sinema or other more quieter moderates would prefer to tank Build Back Better altogether, and the only reason why they may pass it is because progressives are holding the bipartisan bill hostage. I don't think that's an accurate lay of the land. I think all the Democrats know that they're in this together, that if Biden goes down, they all go down. And so there is a sense of mutual interest that I think still remains. But the degree of mistrust between progressives and moderates is not helping anybody right now. So if this was me, and obviously it's not, I would have passed a bipartisan bill off the top in the first place. I wouldn't have done this whole drama. I wouldn't have assumed that you couldn't get to, 1.5 or even 2 trillion plus if this had gone in the more in the more trusting way. But what we're seeing is the mistrust gets higher and higher and higher, and that's leading both camps to dig their heels in more and more and more. It makes it harder to get that final agreement.
Right, but you've got this Representative Jayapal, who was the Progressive Caucus chair, who evidently had a meeting with the president and said she didn't think the social safety framework that was outlined was enough to get progressives to come on board with the infrastructure plan. There's a bunch of stuff that got omitted from there, ripped out.
Yeah.
The fact that we can't get Granny a new set of chompers and some glasses just blows my mind. But we can get hearing, which you go of the three. Was that a flip of a coin, pull of a hat?
I think it was a cost. I think it was a cost thing. The dental is the most expensive of the three. So once you put you argue it's artificial. You have an artificial ceiling on how much you're willing to spend. That's going to force things out of the bill, and the framework is tilted towards doing fewer things for longer time frames than doing everything for short time frames. Progressives want to do as many things as possible, even if the time frames were short, on the notion that, well, these things will be popular, and once we get it established, it'll be hard to cut them off.
That's the camp I'm usually in.
And Manchin and the House New Dems said that's gimmickry. You're not being honest with how much this costs if you're doing it that way. We want to have a truly paid for bill. And if you do child tax credit for 1 year, which, mind you, that is what they're going to do in this thing. Child tax credit's $100 billion a year up through 2026, and that goes up to about $200 billion a year, because the Trump tax cuts had its own child tax credit expansion, which sunsets in 2026. So it costs even more money if you're going to maintain a higher level based on your budget baseline. Costs more money. So if you're doing that for a bona fide 10-year period, it's a $500 billion, I think, through 2026, and then for the next several years, you're going to clear. You're going to go well over $1 trillion. I think it'll be maybe $1.5 trillion over a 10-year period. So that's a big chunk of change. If you're doing even it's a $3.5 trillion bill, that's a big piece of it.
Right.
So from the moderate standpoint, you haven't come clean with how much this really costs if you're not laying that on the line.
Now I look at this and aren't these conversations that should have been hammered out in private? Shouldn't the Democrats, because all we keep seeing is them fighting in public. There are no good headlines, and most people don't even know what's in this plan. Got the headline, Build Back Better, and who could be against Build Back Better? Evidently the entire Republican Party. But all we keep seeing them do is fighting over numbers and fighting over what shouldn't be in it, instead of going out and selling what could have been months ago a massive win and a great messaging vehicle. They've just blown this in every way possible.
It's not over. So there still could, sometimes it's darkest before the dawn. So you still might get to that point. But certainly this process is not helping them. Again, we've had a period since August where if it's not Afghanistan, it's COVID. If it's not COVID, it's the border. If it's not the border, it's the infrastructure bill being blocked. If it's not that, it's the debt limit drama, or it's the supply chain problem. It's always been something for several weeks and months now. And to your other point, if these negotiations started sooner and more quietly, privately, with less posturing, I think this could have been resolved in a smoother way. It's never going to work. What happened was Biden came in with the big moonshot proposal, and without having the buy-in from both the progressives and moderates in advance. The progressives liked it, but the moderates weren't there. And what we're seeing is you can't jam them. I mean, maybe the hope was that we'd have this thing and it would poll well, and they'd see that they were on the losing side of the argument. They would just come around for the good of the party. And it did poll well. The top lines polled well. The basic elements of it poll well. But Manchin and Sinema, and I think others, not always as loudly, had their either provincial concerns or I think more big picture concerns in the case of Manchin and Sinema. And they proved willing to take a lot of heat, more heat than I think people assumed they were going to take. And that problem could have been avoided if there were more discussions, private discussions at the front end of this process and not wait till the back end of this process to get embarrassed and humiliated.
It's time for the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is the voice of the working class, Rick Smith.